My father gave our family business to my sister's boyfriend, and he stole money from it, bankrupted her, and ran away. Hey everyone. Before we jump into this story, I just want to remind you to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It really helps the channel grow, and honestly, not a lot of people watch these stories till the end, so if you could do that now, I'd really appreciate it. Alright, let's get into it. I always thought I knew how my life would turn out. My name is Jackson Collins, but most people just call me Jack. I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been working in my family's business, commercial fishing. It wasn't just a job. It was my entire life. My grandfather started the company 60 years ago with nothing but a single fishing boat, going out on the water before dawn, hauling in whatever he could catch, and selling it right off the docks. Over the years, through sheer grit and hard work, he built something bigger. By the time my father, Richard Collins, took over, we had a full-fledged operation, a fleet of 9 vessels supplying fresh seafood to high-end restaurants all across the East Coast. I grew up on those boats. Some of my earliest memories are of being on the deck of one of them, my small hands gripping the side as I watched the crew haul in nets teeming with fish. While other kids were playing baseball or learning to ride bikes, I was learning how to navigate by the stars, how to repair a net, how to gut and clean fish without wasting an ounce of meat. I knew every captain, every crew member, every supplier, every buyer. There was no question in my mind. I was going to take over the company one day. My sister, Lauren, was different. She was 29, 3 years younger than me, and she never had any real interest in the business. While I spent my summers learning how to steer a boat through rough waters, she was off at camp or hanging out with friends. She changed her major in college 3 times, first psychology, then marketing, and eventually, she settled on graphic design. Even after she graduated, she never really found her footing, bouncing from job to job, never sticking with anything for more than a year or two. And that was fine. Not everyone was built for this life. She didn't have to take an interest in the company because I did. I had worked my ass off to prove that I was ready. I took on more responsibilities, managed crew schedules, handled contracts, made sure our clients were happy. My father always told me that one day, the company would be mine. It was never even a question. At least, that's what I thought. But I was wrong. 2 years ago, my father called for a family meeting, and I was certain it was about the transition of leadership in the company. I had been waiting for this moment my entire life, preparing for the day when he would finally make it official. The company was my future, my legacy, and I was ready to take over. We all gathered at my parents' house, the same home where Lauren and I grew up. My mother, always the perfect host, had made her famous seafood stew, filling the house with the comforting aroma of garlic, tomatoes, and fresh fish. The atmosphere was warm, almost celebratory, and I felt a sense of anticipation building inside me. This was it. This was the night my father would acknowledge everything I had worked for. But then he spoke. "I've made a decision about the future of the company," he said, setting his spoon down and looking at both of us. "I'm passing the business to Travis." At first, I thought I had misheard him. I glanced at Lauren, expecting to see the same confusion on her face, but she only smiled, her hand slipping into the one belonging to her boyfriend. Travis, 34 years old, a guy who had never spent a single day on the water, sat there looking smug, like he had just won some prize he hadn't even entered the competition for. Travis wasn't even part of our world. He was a sales manager at some small startup, a guy who liked to call himself an entrepreneur because he had read a few business books and listened to motivational podcasts. His so-called MBA was nothing more than a 6-week online course that cost him $2,000. The first time I met him, he couldn't even tell the difference between a cod and a haddock. And this was the man my father had chosen to run the business? I sat there, stunned, the words sinking in like a slow-moving poison. "You're kidding," I said, finally finding my voice. "Dad, you can't be serious." But he was. I tried to reason with my father, to make him see the obvious flaws in his decision. Travis had no experience in the fishing industry, no understanding of the hard work it took to keep this business running. He had never negotiated a seafood contract, never managed a crew, never dealt with the unpredictable nature of the ocean. He didn't know how to handle a damaged engine mid-trip, how to adjust for market fluctuations, or how to maintain the relationships that kept our company thriving. But my father simply shook his head and gave me a look like I was the one who didn't understand. "That's exactly the point, Jack," he said. "He brings a fresh perspective." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A fresh perspective? This business didn't need a fresh perspective. It needed someone who knew what the hell they were doing. I glanced toward my mother, hoping for some sign of support, but she avoided my eyes, staring down at her plate as if she wanted to disappear into it. Lauren, on the other hand, looked absolutely radiant, practically glowing with pride. as if Travis had just won an award instead of being handed something he didn't deserve. And Travis himself? He sat there with that smug grin, like he had expected this all along, like this was something he had earned rather than something he had been gifted. Dinner continued, but I barely tasted a single bite. The food sat heavy in my stomach, a mix of anger and disbelief churning inside me. As soon as the meal was over, I followed my father into his office, refusing to let this go. I closed the door behind me and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Dad, I need you to listen to me," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage. "This is a mistake. Travis doesn't know the first thing about running this company. You're handing him something he isn't prepared for. You know I've put my entire life into this business. I know how it works. I know the people. I know what it takes to keep us profitable." My father sighed, rubbing his temples as if I was exhausting him just by speaking. "Jack," he said, his tone the same one he used when I was a kid arguing about curfew. "You're too stuck in the old ways. You know the business as it is, but Travis understands where the industry is going. He knows how to make it modern, how to bring us into the future." I stared at him, completely stunned. This wasn't about modernizing. It was about running a business that had kept our family afloat for generations. It was about knowing how to manage real people, not just looking at spreadsheets and throwing around buzzwords. My father was making the worst decision of his life, and I couldn't do anything to stop him. 6 months after Travis took control of the company, everything started to fall apart. It didn't happen all at once, but the cracks appeared fast, and before long, they widened into gaping holes that no amount of damage control could fix. One of his first brilliant ideas was to raise prices across the board, aiming to position us as a premium supplier. He convinced my father that we needed to focus on exclusivity and target high-end restaurants willing to pay more. What he didn't understand was that our business had been built on long-standing relationships, on trust and consistency. The chefs and restaurant owners we supplied weren't just customers. They were partners who had relied on us for years. Loyalty mattered more than flashy branding or a price tag that screamed luxury. Within weeks, some of our biggest clients started walking away, unwilling to pay the inflated prices. Then came the loss of our best people. Captain Mark, who had been with us for over 20 years, one of the most respected and experienced captains in the fleet, quit after a heated argument with Travis. His exact words before he walked out were, "I don't work for people who don't know the difference between the bow and the stern." And he wasn't the only one. One by one, some of our most reliable crew members started leaving, unwilling to work under someone who had no idea what he was doing but insisted on acting like he did. Instead of focusing on fixing the real problems, Travis poured $60,000 into a brand new website and a sleek new logo, convinced that a modernized look would bring in new business. It didn't. The customers who had already left weren't coming back because of a fancy website, and no new ones magically appeared just because we had a rebranded identity. Meanwhile, the actual operation of the business suffered. Deliveries were delayed, supply chain issues started piling up, and longtime employees who used to take pride in their work now just showed up to collect a paycheck, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The worst decision, though, was the logistics overhaul. Travis, in his infinite wisdom, decided that our shipping and distribution needed a more efficient system. He replaced the routing schedules that had been fine-tuned over decades with a new digital system he found through some consultant he met at a networking event. The result? A 30% increase in fuel costs, longer delivery times, and a nightmare for the captains who now had to follow routes that made no sense. I watched it all happen in real time, helpless to stop it. The company that my grandfather built, that my father had expanded, that I had spent my entire life working for, was crumbling under the weight of bad decisions and blind arrogance. And the worst part was, my father still refused to admit he had made a mistake. Travis's so-called fresh ideas weren't just ineffective, they were catastrophic. He fired 2 of our most experienced accountants, people who had been handling the company's books for over a decade, and replaced them with 2 of his friends. These were guys who had never worked in finance, let alone in a business as complex as ours. One of them ran some kind of fitness coaching side hustle, and the other had been dabbling in crypto investments, which apparently made them qualified to manage a multi-million-dollar fishing operation. The effects were almost immediate. Payrolls started getting delayed, invoices weren't being sent on time, and vendors began complaining about missing payments. The financial stability of the company, which had always been rock solid under my father's careful management, was suddenly in complete disarray. One afternoon at the docks, Ray, our head mechanic, pulled me aside. He had grease on his hands and a look on his face that told me whatever he was about to say wasn't good. "Jack," he muttered, lowering his voice, "this business is going straight to hell. Travis just slashed the maintenance budget, Says we've been overspending on engine repairs. If this keeps up, these boats are going to start sinking. Literally. I could feel the frustration boiling inside me. Preventative maintenance wasn't some luxury. It was a necessity. If we didn't keep the engines in top shape, we were risking everything, from crew safety to delivery schedules. I didn't wait. I went straight to my father's office, determined to make him understand just how bad things were getting. Dad, we need to talk, I said the moment I stepped in. Travis is making reckless decisions. He fired the accountants. He cut the maintenance budget. And if we don't fix this, we're going to start losing more than just clients. We're going to lose boats. But my father barely even looked up from his desk. He let out a tired sigh and shook his head. It's just a transition period, Jack. Travis knows what he's doing. He's just making some adjustments. I stared at him, struggling to believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just some rough patch. This was a disaster unfolding right in front of us. But no matter what I said, he refused to see it. I tried to stay. I kept showing up, trying to salvage what I could, doing everything in my power to keep things from completely falling apart. But it felt like trying to bail water from a sinking ship with a bucket full of holes. Every time I patched one problem, Travis created 3 more. And worst of all, my father, the man who had built this company with his own hands, continued to stand by and watch as everything crumbled, convinced that this was all part of some necessary evolution. Captain Mark had left the company months ago, but he still had his ear to the ground. One evening, he called me out of the blue and told me to meet him at a small diner just outside of town. I didn't know what to expect, but when I walked in and saw the look on his face, I knew it wasn't going to be good. He slid a folder across the table toward me. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his voice low and serious. I opened it and immediately felt my stomach drop. The pages were filled with financial records, payments to a company I had never heard of, transactions that made no sense, and figures that didn't add up. "Where did you get this?" I asked, flipping through the documents. Mark leaned back, arms crossed. "I still have friends in the company, Jack. People who actually care about the business, unlike that idiot running it into the ground. Travis has been funneling money through a fake company. It's owned by his brother-in-law. The invoices are bogus. He's stealing from you." I kept reading, my hands tightening around the papers. It was all there, clear as day. Fake payments disguised as consulting fees, inflated costs for non-existent services, and a slow but steady siphoning of company funds. And that wasn't all. Travis had just bought himself a brand new BMW, fully loaded. Not a company vehicle, not something for business use, but a personal luxury car, paid for with money that should have been going into keeping the company afloat. And as if that wasn't enough, he had also taken Lauren on an extravagant vacation, first-class flights, 5-star hotels, private excursions, expenses that had somehow been buried in the company's books. I sat there, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. It wasn't just incompetence. It was theft. I spent the next 2 days gathering as much evidence as I could. I pulled bank statements, cross-checked transactions, and made copies of everything that pointed to the fraud. When I was sure I had enough, I went straight to my father. I stormed into his office, dropped the folder onto his desk, and said, "You need to look at this. Right now." He let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. "Jack, if this is another attempt to discredit Travis." "It's not," I cut in. "Just read." Reluctantly, he picked up the documents, flipping through them with an expression that shifted from annoyance to confusion, then finally to something that almost looked like fear. I watched as the color drained from his face. He set the papers down, stared at them for a long moment, and then looked up at me. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "It's proof," I said. "Proof that you put a thief in charge of our company. He's not just running it into the ground. He's stealing from it." For the first time since this disaster started, my father didn't argue. He didn't tell me I was wrong, or that Travis knew what he was doing. He just sat there, staring at the undeniable truth in front of him. And in that moment, I knew he finally understood the damage he had done. A week later, I was called into the office. I had a bad feeling the moment I walked through the door. My father was already seated at the long mahogany conference table, his hands folded in front of him, looking as stern as ever. Across from him sat Lauren, arms crossed, an unmistakable look of triumph on her face. And at the head of the table, lounging back like he owned the place, was Travis. I took a seat, bracing myself for whatever was coming. My father cleared his throat, glanced down at the papers in front of him, then looked at me with an expression that I couldn't quite read. "Travis has explained everything," he said, and I believe him. For a moment, I couldn't even process what I had just heard. I had handed him undeniable proof, pages of fraudulent transactions, clear evidence that Travis was bleeding the company dry. And yet, here he was, choosing to believe the liar over me. Lauren leaned forward, her voice sharp with accusation. This is just about your ego, Jack. You've never been able to handle not being the golden child, and now that Travis is in charge, you can't stand it. You're trying to tear him down because you're jealous. I turned to my father, waiting for him to say something, to put a stop to this madness. But he just sat there, silent. Travis let out a small chuckle, shaking his head like he found the whole thing amusing. Jack, I'm trying to be reasonable here. But if you keep spreading false accusations, I might have to take legal action. Defamation is a serious matter, and I have every right to protect my reputation. I had expected my father to see reason, to realize what was happening before it was too late. But instead, he had let himself be manipulated, let Lauren and Travis twist the truth until I was the villain in their story. I looked at all three of them, feeling something inside me go cold. There was nothing left to say. Do whatever you want, I said as I stood up. I'm done. And with that, I walked out, leaving behind the company, the family, and everything I had spent my entire life working for. After walking out of that office, I knew there was no going back. I had lost the company I had dedicated my life to, but I refused to let it break me. Within a few weeks, I landed a job with Harborside Seafood, one of our biggest competitors. They had always been a strong player in the industry, and when they heard I was available, they wasted no time in making me an offer. They brought me in as Director of Operations, a role that gave me real authority and the ability to make decisions without the interference of clueless outsiders. I didn't go into it looking for revenge, but it was impossible to ignore the damage Travis had done to my family's business. The clients he had driven away were more than happy to work with me again. Many of them had been with us for years before he priced them out and treated them like they were disposable. They trusted me, and when I reached out, they followed. Within months, Harborside's numbers surged, and I finally felt like I was part of something stable again. Meanwhile, back at my father's company, things went from bad to worse. Clients continued to leave, the fleet suffered from neglected maintenance, and payments to vendors fell further behind. The damage Travis had done was irreversible, and my father was either too blind or too proud to fix it. Then, a year later, the inevitable happened. The company filed for bankruptcy. I didn't celebrate when I heard the news. I didn't feel victorious. If anything, it was just confirmation of what I had seen coming all along. Late one night, my phone rang. It was Lauren. Her voice was shaking, and I could hear that she had been crying. Jack, please, she sobbed. Help me. Travis is gone. He took everything. I sat there in silence, gripping my phone as the full weight of her words settled in. Travis had drained the last of the company's money, over $200,000, and vanished. No warnings, no explanations. He had packed up and disappeared, leaving Lauren, my father, and the remains of a ruined business behind. And now, after everything, she was turning to me. I wasn't sure why I answered Lauren's call that night. Maybe some part of me still felt the weight of family, despite everything. Maybe I just wanted to hear her admit what I already knew. But when I heard her crying, heard the panic in her voice, I knew things were even worse than I had imagined. The next day, I drove to my parents' house. It had always been a symbol of stability, the home where I grew up, the place where we celebrated holidays, where my mother made her famous seafood stew. But when I pulled up in the driveway, it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place that had been hollowed out by bad decisions and betrayal. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. My mother sat at the kitchen table, her face streaked with tears, clutching a tissue in her shaking hands. Lauren stood against the wall, her arms crossed, her usual confidence completely gone. My father was seated at the head of the table, shoulders slumped, looking like a man who had finally realized just how badly he had lost. He barely looked up when I walked in. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unspoken. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he muttered, Jack, you were right. Help us. I looked around the room, taking in the wreckage of what was left of my family. The house itself was at risk. Travis had convinced my father to take out a massive loan using the property as collateral, promising that it would be an investment in the company's future. That future never came. The debt remained. And now, with the business gone and no way to pay it back, the bank was ready to take everything. I had spent years trying to get them to listen, trying to show them the truth before it was too late. And now that everything had crumbled around them, they finally wanted my help. I didn't answer my father right away. Part of me wanted to walk out, to leave them to deal with the consequences of their own choices. But as I looked around that room, at my mother crying, at Lauren too ashamed to speak, at my father, a man who had once seemed invincible, now broken, I realized that I couldn't. Not for them, but for the business. For the men who had worked for us for decades. For the legacy that had been shattered but still had a chance to survive. So I made a decision. I spent the next few weeks doing everything I could to salvage what was left. I met with vendors, reassuring them that if they gave us a little time, We would pay what we owed. I sat across from bankers who had lost all faith in our company and negotiated a repayment plan that wouldn't leave my parents homeless. I went through the books line by line, cutting what needed to be cut, restructuring everything from the ground up. We lost a lot. Most of the fleet was gone. There was no saving it. 5 of the 9 boats were already auctioned off, and there was no getting them back. Another was in such bad shape after Travis's cost-cutting measures that it wasn't worth fixing. That left us with 3 vessels and a handful of crew members still willing to stand by us. But some things we got back. Captain Mark returned, walking into my office with that same no-nonsense look on his face. "If you're running things, I'm in," he said. "But if I see another Travis, I'm out for good." Ray showed up not long after, shaking his head and muttering, "Took you long enough, kid." We rebuilt, slowly, carefully. We rebranded under a new name, Founding Father Fishing. It was a nod to my grandfather, to the man who had started it all with nothing but a single boat and a determination to make something of himself. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But for the first time in a long time, it felt right. A year later, the company was finally back on its feet. It hadn't been easy, but the effort had paid off. Founding Father Fishing was profitable again, leaner and more efficient than before, but still standing. We had rebuilt trust with our suppliers, stabilized our client base, and, most importantly, restored a sense of pride in the people who worked alongside me. The business had nearly been destroyed, but now, it had a future. One evening, as I was finishing up some paperwork in the office, my father walked in. He looked different. Older, more tired, but also lighter, as if the weight of denial had finally lifted from his shoulders. He sat down across from me, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "I had to tell you this sooner," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You were right, Jack. About all of it. I should have listened to you. I didn't say anything right away. For years, I had wanted to hear those words, but now that they had finally come, they didn't feel like a victory. I just thought." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I thought I was doing the right thing, giving the company a fresh start, moving it into the future. I didn't see what was right in front of me." I nodded, letting the silence sit between us for a moment. "I know," I finally said. "But we made it through." Lauren had changed too. She had stayed, taking a job in the accounting department. Whether it was guilt or just a need to make things right, I wasn't sure, but she worked hard, avoiding the shortcuts and arrogance that had once defined her. We didn't talk about Travis, and I didn't push her to. As for him, there was no coming back. A few months after everything collapsed, news broke that he had been arrested in Cancun for financial fraud. He had run the same game on another company, but this time, he hadn't been able to get away with it. He had stolen from too many people, left too many burned bridges, and eventually, it had all caught up with him. Looking back, I couldn't say I felt anything when I heard the news. No satisfaction, no anger, just relief that he was finally someone else's problem. I had spent years thinking that my future was tied to my father's company, that it was my birthright, something I had earned through years of hard work. But standing there in my own office, running a company under a new name, I realized that none of that mattered. What mattered was what I had built from the ashes of someone else's mistakes. What mattered was that we had survived. A few months after the bankruptcy of my father's company, I received a call from a lawyer named Mark Devereaux. He introduced himself as a corporate fraud specialist and got straight to the point. The FBI had been investigating Travis long before he disappeared. It turned out that our company wasn't the first one he had drained dry. He had done the same thing to at least 2 other businesses. Each time, he had managed to slip away before facing any real consequences. But now, things were different. This time, there was solid evidence. The financial records I had uncovered, the bank statements, the fraudulent invoices, all of it was enough to build a real case against him. "Jack, you're not just another victim," Devereaux told me. "You're a key witness. Without you, this case won't hold up in court." I didn't need convincing. I had watched my family's company collapse because of Travis. I had seen my father humiliated, my mother in tears, my own career nearly derailed because of his greed. There was no way I was letting him get away with it. A week before the trial was set to begin, I received a letter from Travis's attorney. The message was clear. His client was willing to settle. "Mr. Collins, my client is prepared to offer a settlement of $150,000 in exchange for a full withdrawal of the case against him." I read the letter twice, then let out a laugh. 150,000? It was an insult. Travis had stolen far more than that, not just from us, but from the other companies he had destroyed. He was offering a fraction of what he had taken, hoping I would take the easy way out. I didn't even hesitate. I sent my response back through my lawyer. No deal. This wasn't about money. Travis had to answer for what he had done, and I was going to make sure he finally did. The trial began in a packed courtroom, the weight of everything that had happened leading up to this moment pressing down on me. The judge, Jonathan Berkeley, was a seasoned professional, known for his no-nonsense approach to corporate fraud cases. The prosecution came in strong, presenting a clear and compelling case against Travis, backed by mountains of financial records and testimonies that painted a picture of deliberate deception and theft. Captain Mark took the stand first. He was direct and unshaken, explaining how Travis had come in, dismantled years of carefully built relationships, and run the company into the ground. He described the reckless decisions, the complete disregard for the expertise of the people who actually kept the business afloat, and the growing frustration among the crew as they watched everything fall apart. Next was Ray, who didn't hold back. He testified about the dangerous cost-cutting measures, about how Travis slashed the maintenance budget, putting lives at risk, and how he ignored every warning that things were falling apart. He had no idea what he was doing, Ray said firmly, and he didn't care. We told him the boats needed repairs, but he kept saying it was too expensive. If we had kept running things his way, someone would have gotten killed. Then my father took the stand. He looked exhausted, a shell of the man I had once known. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't making excuses. He wasn't defending Travis or dismissing my concerns. Instead, he faced the courtroom, admitted his mistakes, and told the truth. I was blinded by what I thought was progress, he said, his voice strained but steady. I thought I was making the right decision for the future of the company, but I put my trust in the wrong person, and because of that, I lost everything. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. But the most unexpected moment of the trial came when the defense called a new witness, Travis's own brother. Leo Sutton stepped forward hesitantly, looking just as shocked to be there as everyone else. Up until that moment, no one had known what role he played in Travis's schemes, but when he began to speak, it became clear that even his own family had been caught in the web of lies. I thought it was a legal investment deal, Leo said, his voice tense with anger. Travis told me I was part of a consulting firm that handled financial restructuring for businesses. I had no idea the payments were fraudulent. He used my name to make it look legitimate, but I never saw a dime. I didn't know what was really going on until investigators showed up at my door. It was a devastating blow to the defense. Travis hadn't just stolen from business partners and employees. He had manipulated and deceived his own brother. Any remaining credibility he had left was gone. I watched Travis from across the courtroom, waiting for some sign of remorse, some recognition that everything was finally catching up to him. But there was nothing. Just that same smug expression, now cracking at the edges, as the reality of his downfall became impossible to ignore. The turning point of the trial came when my attorney, Mark Devereaux, introduced our financial expert to the stand. The man was calm, methodical, and had spent his career unraveling corporate fraud. He had been analyzing Travis's financial records for weeks, and now he was ready to lay out what he had found. With precise explanations and clear documentation, he revealed that a significant portion of the stolen money had been funneled into offshore accounts in the Bahamas. The transactions were carefully structured, routed through shell companies, and disguised as consulting fees, but the pattern was unmistakable. As the expert spoke, I turned to look at Travis. Up until that moment, he had managed to maintain his usual smug, arrogant expression, as if he still believed he could talk his way out of this. But now, for the first time, I saw the cracks. His hands clenched into fists on the table, his jaw tightened, and his posture stiffened as if he were physically holding himself together. Then, Judge Berkeley looked directly at him, his sharp gaze cutting through the tension in the room. "Mr. Sutton," the judge said, his voice firm and steady. "Can you explain these transactions?" For the first time in the entire trial, Travis hesitated. His confidence wavered, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, thinner, uncertain. I don't know what those are," he said, shifting in his seat. "I never transferred money to offshore accounts." The prosecutor leaned forward. "So you're saying these records are fabricated?" Travis swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I'm saying, I don't recall those transactions." His voice trembled slightly, the first real sign of panic slipping through. He was trapped, and he knew it. Everyone in the room could see it. The carefully constructed facade was collapsing, and the man who had once believed he could manipulate his way through anything was finally out of options. The next day, my sister Lauren was called to the stand. She looked exhausted, the weight of everything that had happened over the past year etched into her face. I knew she had been struggling with guilt, unable to justify to herself how she had once stood by Travis, blindly defending him while he tore everything apart. But I had no idea what she was about to say. She took a deep breath, gripping the edge of the witness stand as if steadying herself. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, she said something that made the entire courtroom shift forward in their seats. I found another recording, she said. Travis made a private recording where he bragged about how easily he manipulated our father. Murmurs spread through the courtroom, but before the judge could call for order, Lauren reached into her bag, pulled out a small flash drive, and handed it to the prosecution. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, we would like to submit this as evidence and play the recording for the court. Judge Berkeley nodded, his expression unreadable. Proceed. The courtroom fell silent as the recording began. Travis's voice crackled through the speakers, clear and unmistakable. That old fool handed me the company on a silver platter, he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. I could have made him sell every last boat and convinced him it was his own idea. A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. My father, who had been staring at the floor for most of the trial, suddenly lifted his head, his face pale. The words rang through the air like a hammer striking metal, cold, calculated, undeniable. Judge Berkeley adjusted his glasses and looked at the prosecutor. Play that again, he said. The recording played once more, every word hitting harder the second time. I turned my gaze to Travis, watching as the last remnants of his composure drained away. His face had gone rigid, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to reach out and stop the recording himself. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. The courtroom remained silent long after the audio ended. No one spoke, no one moved. The weight of what had just been revealed left no room for doubt. Travis hadn't just stolen money. He had played my father like a puppet, manipulated him into handing over a company built over generations, and boasted about it like it was nothing. There was no coming back from this. After 2 long weeks of testimonies, cross-examinations, and irrefutable evidence, the trial finally reached its conclusion. The courtroom was packed, tense with anticipation as everyone waited for the judge to deliver his verdict. Judge Berkeley adjusted his glasses, glanced over his notes, and then looked directly at Travis. His voice was steady, his words deliberate, carrying the weight of everything that had come to light. Travis Sutton, he began, this court finds you guilty of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct. You systematically deceived business partners, manipulated financial records, and stole from those who placed their trust in you. As a result, the court orders the restitution of $1.2 million in misappropriated assets and sentences you to 12 years in federal prison. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Then, a murmur spread through the crowd as the reality of the verdict set in. The bailiffs stepped forward, securing Travis's wrists in handcuffs. He barely reacted at first, but as they tightened around his wrists, he turned toward me. His face twisted with fury, his voice low and venomous as he spat out the words, "You'll regret this, Jack. You have no idea what you've done." I met his gaze without flinching, watching as the last remnants of his arrogance crumbled under the weight of his downfall. Then I let out a small smile and said, "See you in 12 years." He didn't have a response to that. The bailiffs led him away, his steps heavy, his shoulders slumped, no longer the overconfident manipulator who had once believed he could get away with anything. As he disappeared through the courtroom doors, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was finally over. A few months after the trial, for the first time in years, we finally had stability. There were no more threats, no more looming financial disasters, no more con artists tearing everything apart from the inside. We could finally focus on what mattered, running the business the right way. My father, after everything, made his final decision official. He signed over ownership of Founding Father Fishing to me, keeping only a small share as a silent partner. There was no ceremony, no big speech, just a quiet moment in his office as he slid the papers across the desk. He looked at me with something between relief and regret, as if he was finally at peace with what had happened but still carried the weight of his mistakes. "You'll do better than I did, Jack," he said simply, "and I won't get in your way this time." Lauren, after months of distance and silence, finally found the courage to say what I think had been on her mind for a long time. She sat across from me one evening in the office, fidgeting with the pen in her hand, before finally looking up. "I messed up," she said. "I defended the wrong person. I let my pride get in the way, and I didn't see what was happening until it was too late." I let her speak, not interrupting, not letting her off the hook too easily. She took a deep breath before adding, "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to help fix what I can." And she did. She started working in the financial department, taking on the responsibility she had once ignored. It wasn't about making up for the past. It was about doing things the right way moving forward. Captain Mark and Ray, the 2 men who had stood by me when everything had fallen apart, became more than just employees. They became my partners. They had earned that right, not just through their years of dedication, but through their loyalty when it mattered most. They had seen the worst of what had happened, and they had stayed. Now, we were moving forward. stronger, smarter, and finally in control of our own future. One morning, as I was going through the usual stack of mail at the office, I came across an official-looking envelope from a federal agency. At first, I assumed it was just another bureaucratic notice about the trial, maybe a final report or some paperwork to close things out. But when I opened it and started reading, I realized it was something entirely unexpected. The letter explained that during the investigation into Travis's financial crimes, authorities had managed to freeze several of his offshore accounts before he could move the remaining funds. His assets had been locked down, and while most of the stolen money had been spent or hidden beyond recovery, there was still something left. But the part that truly surprised me was what came next. Leo Sutton, Travis's brother, had agreed to hand over a portion of those recovered funds. Even though he had been unknowingly caught up in Travis's schemes, he had cooperated fully with investigators and wanted to do what he could to make things right. The government had authorized a transfer, and as a result, $250,000 had been deposited directly into my business account as compensation for the financial damage caused. I set the letter down, staring at it for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle in. After everything, the betrayal, the collapse, the fight to rebuild, somehow, a part of what had been taken was coming back. It wasn't just about the money. It was the principle. It was proof that, in the end, Travis hadn't won. The system had caught up with him, and the damage he had caused had been acknowledged in a way I never expected. For the first time in a long time, it felt like justice had finally come full circle. A year after the trial, life had finally settled into something that resembled peace. The business was thriving. The chaos of the past felt like a distant memory, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to take a real break. I booked a trip to Mexico, deciding that a week of sun, ocean, and good food was exactly what I needed. One evening, I was sitting at a beachside bar, sipping a drink and listening to the hum of conversation around me when I heard someone call my name. Jackson Collins. I turned, surprised, and saw a familiar face, one of Travis's former accountants. He looked different, dressed in a uniform, carrying a tray. It took me a second to place him, but then it hit me. "You work for Travis?" I said, more amused than anything. He let out a laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, that didn't turn out so great for me. After everything went down, I figured I'd get as far away as possible. Ended up here, working tables." Then, lowering his voice, he leaned in. "You won't believe this, but I saw Travis. He's still trying to pull his old tricks, even in prison. Word is, he's been trying to bribe the guards to get better treatment." I laughed, shaking my head. "That sounds exactly like him. Do me a favor. If you ever see him again, tell him I said hello." The accountant grinned. "Oh, I will." That conversation stayed with me, not because I cared about what happened to Travis, but because it reminded me how far I had come. I had spent years chasing after what was rightfully mine, fighting to undo the damage he had caused. But now my life wasn't about him. He was just another man who had finally been caught by his own greed, and I had moved on. Back home, Founding Father Fishing was stronger than ever. We had expanded into new markets, secured deals with major supermarket chains, and even added another boat to the fleet. What had once felt like a desperate attempt to save a dying business had turned into something bigger than I had ever imagined. And for the first time, I found a balance between work and everything else. Somewhere in the middle of rebuilding, I met Olivia, the owner of a small waterfront restaurant. What started as business quickly turned into something more. She understood my world in a way few people ever had, and before I knew it, she had become part of my life in a way that no one else had managed before. One evening, as we sat outside watching the boats return to the docks, my father joined me. He didn't say much at first, just stood beside me, looking out at the business I had rebuilt from the ground up. Then, after a long silence, he finally spoke. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "You turned out to be a better businessman than I ever was." I didn't need his validation anymore, but hearing those words still meant something. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood at the pier, watching the boats glide across the water. This was my business, my legacy, and for the first time in a long time, I knew that no one could take it from me. I had learned something through it all, something more valuable than any deal or contract. In business, just like in life, the ones who survive aren't the ones who cheat their way to the top. They're the ones who know what they're doing, who put in the work, and who are willing to fight for what's theirs until the very end. And that's how it all turned out. Looking back, it's still hard to believe how much happened, how close everything came to falling apart, and how, in the end, I managed to take back what was mine. The company is stronger than ever. My family has finally learned from their mistakes, and Travis is exactly where he belongs, behind bars. But now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Would you have walked away when they betrayed you? Or would you have fought to take back what was yours? Do you think my father and Lauren really deserved a second chance after everything? And what about Travis? Do you think 12 years is enough for everything he did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective on this whole mess. If you've ever been in a situation where someone took what was rightfully yours, how did you handle it? Looking forward to reading what you all think.